So Martin, my very first toad experience, 5-MeO-DMT,
Hmm.
was in Querétaro with Octavio, who you know.
Yeah.
And it was a real interesting experience. There was people screaming and yelling and really loud. And you know, my friend and I, we weren't loud at all. And and we asked Octavio, how come we were not as expressive as these other people? So I wanted to get your thoughts, and before we get into it, as to why this experience is so different for the average person.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's because each person is coming up against themselves within that experience. That 5-MeO-DMT, whether you're working with pure molecule or whether you're working with toad, it doesn't really matter. It's all fundamentally the same, is a full confrontation or full introduction to the infinite nature of the self. So every person comes to it with their own individual ego, their own individual sense of self. And that individual sense of self has been built up from childhood and has everybody has their own unique wounds. They have their own unique choices that they've made. They've their own sense of identity and how they've formed their sense of self to cope with the reality of living in the world and the apparent duality of subject and object and self and other. So everybody comes to the experience with a completely unique history. And when someone consumes 5-MeO-DMT, the ultimate potential is that they can go all the way into the non-dual experience, the complete dissolution of this individuated sense of self into this universal experience, this sense of universal being. And that is the ultimate nature of being. Now, the ride along the way, up and back from that, is where we see these profound individual differences. Now, see, the non-dual experience itself, the full sense of unity, oneness, infinite being, that's identical across all people. Anyone who has the experience, it's exactly the same as anybody else who has the experience. But every ego comes into that arena with its own unique set of defenses and patterns and habits. And so as those patterns and habits are experienced and either released and transcended or grappled with, because of course people can fight with the experience, they can hold on, they can resist. That's where we're going to see all these individual differences. And so that's why, I've always counseled people that no two experiences with 5-MeO-DMT will ever look the same. And so if you have one person who's screaming bloody murder, you've got another person who's having some kind of cosmic orgasm, you have somebody else who seems to be caught in some kind of paradoxical, like before you recorded, you mentioned that one woman was saying, I'm love, I'm a whore, or something like that. And these kinds of paradoxical qualities show up as well, because in the state of unity, there's a resolution of all these paradoxes. So it's always individually unique about what someone is going to go through. And some people bottle up a lot more than other people, that they resist their natural expression. And so those are the ones who tend to be more vocal. Or it could be, someone who's been searching for a long time for an experience like this. And when they finally have it, it's just, oh, this is it, that they're excited about it. And then other people who maybe have tasted it a little bit before, that they're not quite as ecstatic about the experience. So there's so many different ways. And I always like to tell people that, and getting a chance to observe other people, what you have the opportunity to do there is you observe the different ways that egos react, different ways they resist, different ways they release and open up. And you can usually see various reflections of yourself within there. But it's important to never compare yourself to anybody else's experience, because each person's experience is going to be uniquely tailored for that person, because again, they are confronting and potentially transcending their self in that moment. And that's the only thing that's there, is themselves. And so just as every person is different, every person has their own individual makeup and modes of expression and identity, that's what's going to show up really dramatically in most cases with a 5-MeO experience, in a way that other psychedelics don't necessarily bring out in people.
You've seen you've seen the meme that's going around that has it has LSD, peyote, and it shows the guys are like poking the guy, and he says me on LSD and peyote, and then the next one, the next frame, it says me on 5-MeO, and it has the 5-MeO guy body slamming him.
Yeah. That's about how it goes.
Yeah.
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 And
And surrender, an interesting thing. And the nature of surrender, and the nature of struggle, and the fact that presence versus being in the moment. And you see a lot of these people that have, they talk about bad trip. A bad trip to me is you fighting. It's you're fighting with yourself, and no one's winning.
Yeah. Yeah. And that can be a really hard one to get out of when people are in it. Because it feels, particularly with 5-MeO-DMT, it feels so infinitely overwhelming.
Yeah.
That it's really a shock to the ego. I always describe it as, if you get a full release dose of 5-MeO-DMT, within the first couple seconds of having inhaled it, the ego will be presented with an event in which it will believe thoroughly that it's dying, and that it's never, ever, ever coming back from this experience. Now, the great cosmic joke is that it'll be back in like 10 to 20 minutes, but in the moment, it doesn't feel that way. And that's what's significant, that it's such a unique event. It's something that the ego has never been confronted with before. And it doesn't matter what psychedelics people have worked with prior to this event. It really doesn't matter how much experience they have with meditation or yoga or breath work or other forms of altered states of consciousness, because this is so powerful. It's so rapid. It's so unique that really, well, maybe what would be comparable would be someone who's actually had a physical near-death experience.
Yeah.
That would probably be the only thing where their life really is slipping away and they're kind of confronted with the reality of death. But that's what it feels like in the moment. And there's a very fundamental choice that the ego can make in these first few seconds of the experience. It can choose to say, okay, I'm dying and I'm just going to let it happen and I'm going to go with it. Or the ego can resist. And even more subtly within that there are lots of places where people hold on with their ego that they're not consciously aware of. So when confronted with this event, many people feel that they don't have the opportunity to consciously make the choice to let go. But that's one of the beauty of 5-MeO-DMT, that if you have subtle, secret, hidden places where you're holding on, this psychedelic will find it within a matter of seconds. And so therefore, then you have the opportunity to become conscious of it, and then let it go, and then move on.
Yeah.
And then maybe find the next little kernel where you're holding on, and then let that one go. But it does take courage to do that, because it is a tremendous event.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. And
the difference is, yeah.
Yeah.
You can't really describe it.
Yeah, it's really profound. And the different ways that people react, I mean, there are like kind of categories, as someone who served this medicine to people for many years that I got the opportunity to see a wide array of how people react. And so there are certain tendencies that show up. But again, it's going to be unique for each individual. I mean, we can say, well, there's resistance. Well, how does resistance show up? Well, there's lots of different ways that resistance shows up. There's also indulgence. And how does that show up? Lots of different ways. And then there's just letting go. And when letting go happens, that's where it becomes universal.
Right, right, right. So obviously we're going through a shift right now.
Yeah.
As we're recording this, obviously the coronavirus outbreak is going on. And I wanted to read to you a quote that speaks to me. And it's something that I often wonder as a society, are we going to rise up to this? And it's an old quote, and it goes, "The psychedelic experience is essential to your understanding of your humanness as having sex or having a child or having responsibilities or having hopes and dreams. And yet it is illegal. This is an outrage. It's a sign of cultural immaturity. And the fact that we tolerate it is a sign that we're living in a society as repressed as any society in the past." And I'm sure you're familiar with who wrote it and whatnot. It's not really important, but where are we moving? Is the evidence that we're moving in this direction towards a more sane, more culturally mature being? Are we seeing people? Is that what's driving people's interest in psychedelics now? And is that what we're seeing in terms of so many people, at least with mushrooms, for instance, and obviously they're starting to be decriminalized in a lot of municipalities. Is this a glimpse of what's to come? Are you hopeful?
I am very hopeful. And I do think that we are, well, a lot of things are uncertain right now, obviously, with coronavirus and all the disruptions around the world. But I do think that overall, societies across the globe are really becoming more open to the reality of psychedelic experience, psychedelic therapy, the transformations that it makes possible. And if we look at the long history, we can see a very sort of interesting trajectory where, if we go way back in time, use of psychedelics, when we were all just living in nomadic tribal cultures, that was a fairly universal phenomenon. I mean, we can find archaeological evidence from around the world that really clearly shows that wherever there have been mind-altering fungi and plants and substances, people have been using them. And, long before humans ever created alcohol, which really came along with, quote unquote, civilization. So human beings were using these things from the very earliest times. And we also know that animals that exist in the wild regularly also seek out mind-altering plants and fungi and substances. So it seems to be just a fundamental drive of living beings. I mean, because we are all conscious, and anything that has the capacity to alter consciousness is inherently of interest to a conscious being, okay? So back in the times of nomadic life, we had the shamans, and probably, the variety of different cultures, and some cultures, like we can see in more modern day cultures that use entheogens, that sometimes it's just the shamans who take it, but other times it's the entire tribe, it's the entire collection of people. Children are introduced to it. But there is still kind of like protected knowledge among the shamans that maybe your average person, for example, might not know how to brew ayahuasca properly, that that's really the shaman's role. But then as we moved into more established civilizations and religions, what we can see historically is that then use of psychedelics became kind of the secret property of priestly castes. Right? We can see this very clearly in the development of Hinduism, for example. And so that then sort of the general knowledge about the efficacy of psychedelics kind of got lost to the general population within large scale civilized societies, you know, that have agriculture and have political systems and complex economic systems and complex religious mythologies and rituals and practices and things like that. And then we can also see that then it was after that that then various substitutes became developed in terms of ritualized symbolism, and then also the growth, like particularly in the Indian traditions, the growth of the meditation and yoga traditions, which really come out of psychedelic use, but in some sense became a replacement for the use of psychedelics. And so then a lot of this knowledge was basically lost over time because the psychedelic knowledge was kind of contained by the priestly caste, and then through the substitutions and through the symbolization, that then it kind of washed out of society completely. Like I think a good example of this is in Sikhism, for example, which is a religion that comes out of India, that they serve a drink called amrita, which comes from soma, which goes back to the ancient Rig Veda, which is all about how to use psychedelic plants to have a non-dual mystical experience. But by the time Sikhism comes around and they're serving amrita, it's purely a symbolic drink that it's here. I mean, it's like, you know, flavored fruit juice, things like that, where it's no longer the real sacrament. And that people who practice Sikhism, that they have no knowledge of that actual amrita is a psychedelic brew. Okay. And the same thing happened in Buddhism, you know, so we can see how this knowledge got lost. So then in the modern world, we had kind of this reintroduction through the avenue of science, where Westerners started to become aware of psychedelics. And sort of the first was mescaline and psilocybin and then LSD. And a lot of that was spurred by encounters with indigenous cultures in the Americas, right? And anthropologists started to get interested in, well, what is this peyote thing? And so what's the chemical that does that? And what are these mushrooms that people are eating in Mexico? And finally, you know, some anthropologists decided to drink ayahuasca. You know, you can read early anthropology about indigenous cultures in South America, and they would kind of scoff. They would say, yeah, the natives drink this drink and they say that they can talk to the ancestors and the spirits, and ha 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 ha. You know, what primitive people. Don't they know that they should go to church and read the Bible? But anyway, then people finally started trying these things, you know, through ethnopharmacology. Yeah. And so it got reintroduced. And so then there was scientific interest, but then it got out into culture. And of course, then we had the backlash, the war on drugs. But we're now at a point where the medical, scientific efficacy and also the cultural value of these things is just undeniable. And that we have lived through, I mean, if we wanted to kind of characterize Western culture, this is kind of a joke that I say, but if we want to characterize Western culture, we could kind of say, well, look, Western culture has been drunk for a couple thousand years, okay? Western culture has been fed by alcohol. Yeah. And now we are being fed by these consciousness expanding agents. And so that's really where we're seeing a profound shift. And that in a sense now, again, if we go back to the ancient tribal times where everybody was consuming psychedelics, and then it got held by the priestly caste, and so it was super top secret and we can't tell you, and it was held onto by secret societies and things like that. Well, now we have this general openness around the knowledge, and so that it's no longer like no one holds the keys to the kingdom anymore. Right. And we all know that, okay, the kingdom is within, and these are keys that help to unlock the door. But we now have general widespread knowledge about it. And because there's knowledge, there's a demand for change.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm a Californian, and obviously you're in Oregon, so our states are obviously at the forefront of acceptance of you know, allowing people to choose their own medicine, at least to some degree. And hopefully this is just the beginning and tip of the iceberg, and this continues as we've, I guess, seen for a few years now.
Yeah.
But you know, it is interesting. You know, the FDA right now is renewing its attacks on kratom, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Um, Absolute insanity. It's you know, the number of opioid deaths that we have, and the fact that you have kratom, and a lot of opioid users use cannabis, and they've had success with both of these two compounds, and the fact that sanity is not prevailing. Like you said earlier, the allowing everyone access is obviously not a good thing for those that are controlling the access.
Yeah. Well, I think that we have to understand that there is a certain momentum and inertia behind societal structures.
Mm.
And so that the drug war mentality is still very much present within the architecture of our society.
Right.
So it is shifting in some areas, but it's because these decisions have always been made based off of presumptions and not necessarily scientific fact or data, that those tendencies are hard to overcome. You know, like for politicians, it's really easy to score points still within society, within the broader society, to say, hey, I want to outlaw this. And that, you know, we've been fed this drug war propaganda for several generations now. And so for people who are outside of these circles that know the benefits of kratom, that other people are just like, oh, it's a new drug.
Right.
Oh my goodness, drugs are bad. We've got to stop it. So it's easy. And it's harder to do the work of, well, let's actually study it and let's look at what's going on and how it's being used. So in some sense, sort of these regulatory programs, they're kind of lazy.
Yeah.
And it's just because it's part of the machinery. Like if you have an institution that's set up to outlaw certain things, well, then that's what it's going to do until we dismantle it. Right. And shift the paradigm. And the paradigm is being shifted in many areas, but it hasn't infiltrated all the way into the federal government for the most part. You know, that this is something that's been happening, like if we look at cannabis, marijuana, that's something that has gone from state to state, and the federal government still hasn't caught up with it yet. And so when we're dealing with things like kratom and psychedelics, I think that we can probably expect pretty much the same, that it's going to happen more at the local level, and hopefully eventually the federal government will catch up. And at least in the meantime, if they could just take a back seat and say, well, let's see the scientific studies and let's see the scientific data. I mean, it's still ridiculous, like with cannabis, that it's still a Schedule 1 illegal narcotic, which it's not even a narcotic. And if it's Schedule 1, it has no medicinal value. We know that that is patently false. Right. It has to have high potential for addiction. We know that that's not true. So there's still a denial of reality that takes place at the federal level. And, you know, with the way the federal government works, it's just this partisanship impasse where nothing gets done.
Right.
So.
Yeah, it's comical. It fails the test of what actually is a scheduled drug on all checkpoint. I mean, yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, and the same with psilocybin. You know, it just, that there's no, if you're rational about it, there's no way psilocybin could be a Schedule 1 drug. Yet, that's how it's treated.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't even work the next day. So how could you, as if you would want to be like that all the time, it's not even logistically possible to abuse it.
Yeah, yeah. But again, it's just easy. It's easier for politicians to say, I'm against drugs.
Right.
I'm doing my job. Re-elect me.
I think there's too many people, though, that will have the audacity to be holding a glass of wine and while they're holding wine or beer, which is fine. I mean, you should be able to choose whatever you want to put in your own body. Jeez. But don't be holding a glass of wine or beer and have the nerve to tell people that you don't use drugs. I mean, it just, yeah. Anyways, so one thing I wanted to ask you,
Yeah.
People that have read your books and see the conclusions that you make, and one of them obviously was very valuable to me. It was a question that I had sought after for many, many years. And interspersed within that, a lot of your conclusions, I think people would be surprised to find out that you're a professor of religion. So, could you talk about that a little bit? And I think it's really interesting for people that haven't read your books or think that there's just a conversation about psychedelics in general.
Yeah. So I find religion to be very interesting. Yeah, I teach religion at Southern Oregon University. That's the area that I have my master's and my Ph.D. and I did my undergraduate study as a religious studies major. Minor, a philosophy major. And I grew up in a scientific materialist, atheist, secular humanist household, so I didn't grow up religious in any way, shape, or form. And that I got into studying religion because initially it's because I got interested in Buddhism. That when I was introduced to Buddhism, I was kind of shocked because, I grew up in Northern California. Most of the people that I knew who were religious were rather fundamentalist about it. People, as a kid, that I accepted the theory of evolution. It just made perfect sense to me. But then, I had friends in school that were like, wow, do you know that Martin believes in evolution? I was like, what? He's like, no, God created the world in 7 days and the earth is only 6,000 years old. And it's like, what the fuck is wrong with you? What do you mean? The science is interesting. That science, actually tells us and informs us about the world we live in.
Right.
So my impression of religion as a young person was just people believing mythological nonsense that has no basis in reality whatsoever.
Right.
And then when I discovered Buddhism, it's like, whoa, this is really interesting because I read this book by this Buddhist and there wasn't anything in the book that I felt I needed to disagree with or that contradicted with empirical science in any way. So that's how I got into Buddhism and I got into religious studies because I wanted to study Buddhist philosophy, but philosophy programs at the university level in the United States are very parochial, that they only teach Western philosophy, that if they were accurately labeled, philosophy departments would be labeled Western philosophy. And there's a whole world of philosophy out there that's not Western philosophy. Right. So that's how I got into it, but it wasn't because I was religious. It's because I was interested in the philosophy and the Buddhist views of the nature of the self, the nature of reality, and the nature of the mind. And then I got into psychedelics. I got into mushrooms. I was like, whoa, maybe there's something to this whole shamanism thing because this is pretty trippy. And so I was kind of a Buddhist shamanic approach. And then, fast forward many years to when I had my first full non-dual experience via consumption of 5-meo-dmt, to be kind of cliche. That was just, the veil was drawn, the curtain was drawn, and got to see behind the scenes. It's like, oh, everything is one universal being in consciousness interacting with itself all the time. And it's infinitely aware, infinitely present, infinite energy, infinite love, and wow, it's me, and it's you, and it's the computer, and it's the air, and it's the light, and it's everything. So it was this revelation of just the totality of the unitary nature of being.
Yeah.
And kind of in my process of coming to grips with that, or I should, even that's like the wrong linguistic metaphor to use. I should say, in loosening my grip on my own identity and allowing myself to rest in that nature of the unitary nature of being, that I came to a completely different understanding of the nature of myself, the nature of reality, the nature of being and consciousness in general. And it was at that point that I found that many of the conclusions that I was drawing, based on my own direct experience, were largely in disagreement with a lot of what I had studied from various religious traditions. And that there were aspects of certain parts of religious traditions where, like, okay, that sounds right, but the majority of this, no. And so it's a strange position to be in, from going from, you know, I would say a lot of people are just sort of agnostic about religions in general, where they could say, well, you know, maybe that's true, maybe that's true. We don't really know. There's no way to know. So who's to say which religion is right and which religion is wrong or whatever. But I came through this process with a clear, energetic sense of certainty about what I agreed with and what I disagreed with. Right. And it wasn't shamanic, it wasn't Buddhist, it wasn't Advaita Vedanta, it wasn't Taoist, it wasn't Christian, and it wasn't Muslim. You know, I didn't have, like, none of those boxes fit what my direct experience was. So out of that, I have, you know, so this is back in 2008, 2009, and pretty much I've been busy sort of articulating what I learned from all of this since that time period. And for a lot of people, it is kind of shocking, because I'm someone who not only says God is real, because that's what I refer to the Unitariness as, that's God. I'm also kind of brazen, and I say, yeah, and it's me, I'm God, and guess what? You're God, and none of these religions are true. None of them are accurate. Right. And so it can be startling for people. But for me, it has felt like, honestly, it's a service to humanity, I feel. And it's in alignment with what I feel inside myself. And for me, coming through all of this, the most important thing in life is to be authentic and true to yourself and to your energy. And so if I didn't do this and kind of stick my neck out there, that I would just feel like I wasn't living. Right. And so there's just an insistence, like, and even when, you know, I first started articulating this on my podcast, and people were freaking out back in 2008, 2009. I mean, they're just freaking out on me. And then over the course of a week, I wrote my book, Being Human. And that was kind of my first, like, really succinct articulation of this. And it's funny, like a few weeks ago, I was doing a consultation with this guy. I forget where he was, but he said that he had read Being Human, and he was like, whoa, this is it, you know? And he got excited, like, oh my God, someone has cut through the bullshit, and like, this is it. And so he really resonated with what I wrote in there. And so then he said, yeah, and I gave your book to my girlfriend, and she got so angry, she threw the book across the room at me and just like, what the hell do you see in this guy? And I said, well, you know, that's kind of how people tend to react to what I shared, that they either are like, oh my God, this is it, or the ego arises and resistance arises and anger. And so, like, the way that I present things, you know, for good or for bad, I don't leave a lot of middle ground or wiggle room. And then it's either you're going to jive with what I have to say, or I'm probably really going to piss you off.
Yeah, and if you read the reviews, obviously, it's I mean, very few things do you see such a contrast. You know, some are delivered from, you know, finally, you know, I mean, it makes sense, and it makes sense to the degree that you're open to, you know, here's an explanation in light of no explanation, basically that's like my friend Delanca, who I talked to you about a lot. You know, he basically says, you know, it's a matter of accepting that we don't know. And in light of that, your model to me makes the most sense.
Yeah.
You know, because and you know, it's fair the way you lay it out. You say that, you know, you could take the left or the right side. Neither can prove that they're right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've tried to present things as like, look, I'm not going to argue for this.
Yeah.
And even that pisses some people off, you know, because people want to get into arguments and they want to have proof. But it's just, look, based on my experience, I'm going to describe to you the nature of reality. I could be wrong. I personally don't think so, but I'm just going to describe it to you. But I'm not really going to argue for it. And I'm going to make some very strong claims about what's real and what's not real.
Right.
And yeah, for some people it's a breath of fresh air and it's very liberating, and for other people it really rubs against what they believe or want to believe or been, you know, trained to believe.
Yeah.
And that's why I always also go back to things like 5-MeO-DMT and say, well, you know, you can try this yourself, and you know, then you can see. And that's where, see, back when I first started sharing all of this, most people had no idea what 5-MeO-DMT was.
Right.
And even a few people who didn't see it as that valuable. Kind of following on Terence McKenna's model, where he said, you know, oh, well, I tried 5-MeO-DMT and all I got was this feeling, versus I smoked DMT and I see machine elves and aliens and I really hallucinate. And isn't that fascinating? And so back in, you know, 2008, 2009, a lot of people were very dismissive of 5-MeO-DMT, and most people had never tried it. And now there is widespread interest around the world in 5-MeO-DMT because people are starting to understand that it really does present you with the opportunity to go all the way into the infinite nature of the self and have this non-dual experience. And the thing about the non-dual experience is that once you have it, it becomes very clear that every experience you've ever had other than that is of a lesser order of magnitude and a lesser order of reality, in a sense. So that now that more people are having this experience, they're able to then appreciate, well, then what does it really mean that everything really is one? Now, that's a belief that many people have. That's a statement that many people accept. I accepted it before I had that experience, but I couldn't say that I actually knew what it meant.
Right.
And then once I had the experience, like, oh, wow, everything really is one. I mean, it really is one. Then that's not just a feel-good kind of thing, and it's not just some statement, but wow. And so all of my viewpoint has been informed by that reality.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, the human ego is interesting. And then if you think about it, the fact that just being a human is interesting. We have thoughts about our thoughts and we have feelings about our feelings.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, like the real animals don't have these problems.
Yeah, yeah. And even that is something that I've said within my books and in my lectures, where I've tried to talk about that. Well, like, the human ego is really unique, and sometimes people just get pissed off at that. And they're like, oh, no, you know, animals, they're just as much people as we are, and it's like, man, that they don't fuck with themselves the same way that we do, because we have thoughts about our thoughts and feelings about our feelings. Whereas in general, animals, other than humans, they have their thoughts and they have their feelings, but they don't have these second and third and fourth order narratives going on about everything that they're experiencing. So they're just much more present in whatever it is that they're experiencing. But, you know, even there, I've received a lot of pushback from people where there's like, oh, well, you know, you're just going back to that humans are better. And I was like, no, I'm not trying to say humans are better. Just trying to say that we're actually different, that we are unique, that we have a unique experience of being
Right.
that other animals don't have to grapple with. And it's both a blessing and a curse, because the blessing is that from that is everything that humans create and everything that humans investigate, and every, all art and philosophy and science and music and culture and religion, all of it comes from that. But it also means that we are prone to making things up, projecting, becoming attached, and contorting ourselves in a way that, I always reference my dog. She shows up in my talks all the time. But I always say that, when she barks, she doesn't then get into a thing about, wow, well, did I sound doggy enough in that bark, or maybe I shouldn't have barked right now, that, maybe, she doesn't have that level of contemplation. No, there's a stimulus and she barks,
Yeah.
but human beings were way more complicated than that.
Yeah. 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 And I think what's interesting is when people even realize, most people don't even realize that the ego is at work, but then the next step is the realization that it's at work. And then of course the illogical next step of, okay, well, I'm gonna kill my ego, or I'm gonna dissolve my ego, and the idea that's, I mean, you're alive, so therefore, I mean, short of being raised by wolves and not learning language, and probably are learning language, the byproduct of learning language is the development of the human ego, short of, you being that one person they made a movie about. It is what it is.
Yeah. And I think also kind of spiritually that we've been sold a false bill of goods from a lot of the mystical traditions,
Yeah.
which have promoted this idea of that the ego is bad. And like in the Eastern traditions, they basically say that the ego is bad and that you'll be reincarnated infinitely until you can get over it. And at that point, you leave reality in some sense. And so there's this, and this is true in many religious traditions, where they look at the lived world that we live in and say that there's something bad about it. And so the spiritual quest, the religious quest, is to get out of this.
Right.
And one of my first impressions from my non-dual experience was like, well, man, the ego is just trying to get the hell out of here, but God's just trying to get in.
Right.
And if we are that, then we're actually trying to get in as well. And so this whole notion of like permanently killing your ego or removing your ego and just sitting in a state of samadhi all the time until you die and reach parinirvana or moksha or samadhi, or whatever the tradition wants to call it, that even that is just more projection of the ego, and that actually prevents people from being fully within their life as a human being.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's pretty wild. It's almost like acceptance is really, is really the only quote unquote way out.
Yeah, yeah, accepting you are here.
Right.
And so that's why we go back to what I said earlier, that the most important thing is being true to yourself and being authentic and being genuine, right? It's not about where am I going to get to when I die, or how do I need to reach the next level of spiritual realization, or how do I hit the next ceremony or read the next book or do the next workshop. No, it's all about how do you just be present with who you are right here, right now. And I think personally, that's why I tend to resonate more with the forms of Buddhism that were more prevalent in, say, China and Japan, such as Zen Buddhism.
Yeah.
There's, something interesting that happened when Buddhism moved out of India into East Asia is that it entered into these cultures that didn't have the basic assumption that we find in India of reincarnation is a thing and it's a problem and you have to get over it so you can finally get out of reality. But when Buddhism moved into China and Japan and Korea and those areas, these are cultures that don't believe in reincarnation. So they didn't have that fundamental assumption that was present within Indian culture. And so there, things like Buddhism and Taoism were able to blend together, and there you find more the sense of spontaneous action within the moment, and that there's not so much the concern about reincarnation and or about reaching some final state of liberation that comes after death, or that you have to sit in meditation all the time in order to achieve, but it's more, you know, chop wood, carry water, that kind of thing.
Right. So speaking of the ego, the debate still carries on, you know, synthetic versus organic. And there's of course a great joke, you know, getting attacked by a bear is extremely organic. It's just not good for you.
Yeah.
Oh, wh- is this an egoic attachment? Why do we keep, why does this keep coming up?
Oh, it's totally ego. It's 100% ego. That's all that it is. And it's all related to cultural dynamics, right? That in Western cultures, which are now re-encountering psychedelics, there is a common cultural trope is that, well, culture is bad, science is bad, industry is bad, and nature is all good, right? And so you got to be organic,
And we're
right?
typing this from behind our keyboards as we're
Yeah.
right?
Everybody's got to get back to nature. So watch my video channel, you know, on YouTube. But it's just a basic assumption that, like, oh, chemicals, and even the idea of like chemicals are bad, herbs are good. I said, but like my dad's a chemist, and this is my dad is, because I got on that bandwagon, you know, as a teenager and an environmental activist, that, you know, I was definitely a part of that. And my dad said, don't you know that everything in reality is made up of chemicals? And he said, there is no chemical difference between something that's made in a lab and something that's produced, quote unquote, in nature. Now, the method for how it came about, that's different, but the end product, we're just dealing with atoms and molecules here, and there's no difference. And so it fits into a cultural paradigm of people who want to be more natural and more in touch with nature, that they think it's important to get their psychedelic compounds from nature. And then they also attach what I just see as meaning stories. And anywhere that you have the introduction of meaning, I think that that's always a red flag. And so people talk about how, oh, but in nature, it has good energy. But anything that's made in a lab, well, then you have the energy of all the people who made that chemical, and they might have had negative thoughts and negative emotions, and that's going to imprint the molecule, and you don't know what you're going to get from that. But we made this batch with good intentions and prayers, and we put a bunch of meaning into it. And so that's, for me, that's always just, look, that's just your ego talking. That's just your ego talking. Right. And if you want to do that, that's fine. But to think that reality cares, no, it doesn't care. So if you take a 5-meo-dmt molecule, and if you get it from nature, and if you get it from the lab, the experience is identical. There's no difference. So if we want to talk about in terms of effectiveness, then there's no comparison. Then if we want to talk about sustainable harvesting, that's a different issue. If we want to talk about what are the chemical byproducts and waste that is made through making something in a lab, and you know, we can talk about other issues, but if we want to talk about what's better or worse in terms of the experience, that you do see in a lot of psychedelic forms where people just talk about, I mean, they get on an ego high horse where they say, oh, that stuff that's made in a lab, that's just crap, and no one's going to have a good experience with that. But if you get it from nature, then, you know, it's made by nature, and therefore it's better. But I mean, there's no reason to actually say that, other than that there's some ego attachment to the story and the identity that, oh, I'm a natural person, you know. But it's just a story, and reality doesn't care what your story is.
Right. It's just surprising we're still having that conversation. What are your thoughts on, you know, obviously most people who have tried and have had a psychedelic experience have had mushrooms or LSD. What are your thoughts on, you know, because you talk with some people and they say, well, it doesn't matter. And then others will say, well, I advise them to think of it as a step approach, meaning, you know, don't just dive into the pool with 5-MeO. You should work your way up. What are your thoughts on that? Because I don't remember you ever talking about it one way or the other. Maybe I missed it.
Yeah, well, I guess it kind of depends ultimately on the context, I would say. Like, for example, sometimes people contact me and they say, hey, I got a hold of some 5-MeO-DMT. How do you recommend I go about using it? And if it's someone, usually the first thing I say to them is find someone who's experienced with it and have them introduce you to it. But then some people are like, no, I'm just going to do it on my own. And in that case, then I will usually tell them, well, then start small. Right. And work your way up. But in terms of where 5-MeO-DMT really becomes most effective is when you get a full release dose, when you have a dose that's sufficient enough to completely overwhelm your ego so that you can have this non-dual experience. And the thing about working up to that is that none of your experiences prior to the full non-dual experience will ever inform you about the nature of the non-dual experience. So in other words, you can dip your toes in the water as much as you want, but that's never going to tell you what it's like to suddenly be catapulted out into the middle of the ocean.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So, you know, it's just in terms of practicality and safety measures that if somebody's working on their own, you know, take it slowly, work your way up. But ideally, if you have someone who is qualified, who you can trust, and who knows what they're doing, the most effective thing is just to take the full dose and not to do these little workup things, because, you know, the workup, it doesn't tell you what the full potential is.
Well, actually, my question was more, do you recommend, like, someone that has no experience whatsoever?
Yeah.
What I was getting at is, you know, it seems like half the people would, and I tend to be on this side, you know, go have an experience with mushrooms. You know, you ride a tricycle first before getting on the bike. Then the others will say, nah, it doesn't matter. And actually, it'd probably be better to start out with the top of the food chain. So I was curious where you fit in, one way or the other.
Yeah, I think ultimately it doesn't matter. That it's just up to individual choice where people want to start. Back when I was serving 5-MeO to people, I worked with plenty of people who had never had a psychedelic experience prior to having 5-MeO-DMT. They did just fine. And I would also say that I had plenty of people who had prior psychedelic experience, sometimes, you know, really years and years and years worth of psychedelic experience. And in some sense, that could be a limitation, because sometimes I had people coming thinking they knew what they were getting into, because it's like, oh yeah, you know, I've been drinking ayahuasca for 30 years. So, you know, you don't need to tell me about what this is about. And so I kind of have a funny demonstration. I've done this in other interviews before, where I've had people like that, where they start and they take their hit and they're like, but then it goes, oh, you know, and you can just see it on their face. Like, yeah, that escalated quickly, didn't it? You weren't expecting that, were you? So that's where I say that, look, it doesn't really matter how many psychedelics you've taken before 5-MeO-DMT. If you haven't had 5-MeO-DMT, you haven't had 5-MeO-DMT. So that, you know, in some instances that it might provide people with a sense of comfort within psychedelic spaces, but I definitely don't think it's necessary at all. And again, I've seen plenty of people who the very first psychedelic they've tried was 5-MeO, and they've had beautiful, amazing, transformative experiences. So it's not necessary that you have to work your way up to it. Gotcha. But if somebody wants to do that, well, that's fine.
Sure. So what could you walk us through? I know you're retired now, but from coaching, but could you give us I should say the physical aspect, meaning taking the 5-MeO. Could you walk us through what briefly a session with you when you were a practitioner looks like and felt like?
Yeah. Well, uh, usually when people first contacted me, um, I might try and scare them off a little bit. That's kind of step number one. And then if they're really serious, then we kind of proceed from there. Um, I had a PDF that I would often send out to people and say, okay, well, read this. And then if after reading that, if you still want to come do this with me, then we can talk.
Right.
And that actually did scare off a number of people. So that was great. And then for people who'd actually come and work with me, the first thing we would do whenever someone would arrive over is we'd sit down and I would kind of walk them through. It would take anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour of discussing what 5-MeO-DMT does, and also not just the medicine itself, but what kind of events might occur within our session, how they might react, how I will be working with them or not working with them, and also my guidelines around symmetry versus asymmetry, which I have found to be the most fundamental key element. So it's been a lot of time introducing people to that. And
Can
then,
can you mention that just for someone that's not familiar with your books and what
yeah, so
that
yeah, the basic idea is that when people go fully into the non-dual experience with 5-MeO-DMT in this highly amplified energetic state, what happens is their bodies open up with bilateral symmetry, and there's always a mirroring between the left and right sides of the body. And that then when the ego comes back, there's almost instantaneously the introduction of some kind of asymmetry in terms of people's body postures or movements. Okay. And people move a lot on 5-MeO-DMT. Not everyone, but many people do. And when they are moving in the non-dual state, it's always like their hands might come together here, but their hands would never, ever cross in the non-dual state. And they might, there's this rolling motion that takes place where people are just kind of undulating like this, right? But they would never put one hand up and one hand down. They would never cross their limbs, and this is all stuff that spontaneously happens. The people aren't aware that they're doing it. But then as soon as the ego comes back in, then all of a sudden they're like, whoa, and you see these asymmetries take place. So my fundamental guideline is that you want to learn how to work in symmetry, because the ego almost always functions through energetic asymmetries within the body and within the mind. And that the non-dual state is balanced, open, and symmetrical. So that you want to work with symmetry with your medicine experience in order to help you become aware of where your ego is trying to pull you into asymmetries, and that you can process the energy more cleanly through the experience by working in symmetry. So for me, it's a very, very fundamental key. So I spent a lot of time writing about this and talking about it. And for people who experience it, the general response I get back from people was like, that was the key, that by working in symmetry, my experience went to places it's never been before. Right. So I see it as very, very fundamental, very simple, and also in many instances, very challenging for people to do because the ego reacts and it wants to get asymmetrical. So within the session, we'd talk about all that before introducing people to the medicine. And then I always worked with people one-on-one. And my preference was for people to lie down because most people end up down at some point.
The prayer where you see Buddha and the feet and hands together.
Yeah. This is a fundamental posture. And actually, if you look at most sacred art around the world, and also if you look at a lot of psychedelic visionary art, bilateral symmetry predominates.
Hmm.
It's everywhere. And it's like no one really figured out why before. Why is that? Why is it that when you make a psychedelic image, people want to make this nice bilateral symmetry? It's because that's the energy of the openness of the experience. Okay, so it's almost like this was an unconscious thread that was moving through artistic forms that people weren't really fully aware of. So then, in working with people, I would always position myself right in front of people, and there would be a mat out in front, and that's for the person then to lie back down on the mat. Now, there's no requirement for people to lie down, but the vast majority of people do want to lie down, especially if they really open up, that they just want to, boom, they fall back and they kind of go spread eagle, nice and open. And the way that I worked with people was that we would both be consuming 5-meo-dmt together. So I would hold the pipe and I'd light it for the client, and they would take a hit, and then I would take a hit, and then, you know, whatever was going to happen is what was going to happen at that point. And my model was to give people 3 rounds of medicine within a session, because I found that most people would have some kind of arc of ego resistance or holding on or processing and letting go, and that by allowing people to have a hit and then go back in and then go back in again, that I found that to be very effective for really processing through a lot of energy and bringing it to a point of completion, which for me was always the most important. That with 5-MeO, you get all this energy that goes boom, it just explodes.
Yeah.
And that I always wanted people to leave grounded, not just still in this kind of state, right? And so there's the advantage if you keep going back in, that you get a chance to work through all these different layers of the ego and work through repressed energy and things like that, and then ground it into reality at the end. And it was also very important that, you know, there's this position between myself and the client, because being directly in front of someone helps someone stay symmetrical, especially since I'm there in symmetry, that then they could kind of mirror me, versus like being off to the side, that kind of draws people's attention to the left or to the right. And so it actually increases the likelihood that someone's going to have some kind of egoic experience. So just the physical positioning was very important. And also making sure that if they brought anybody with them, that there's no interaction between people who are witnessing, and that the people who are there to witness, that they're not distracting the person in any way, not making noise, not getting involved in whatever it is that's taking place. So, you know, and all my guidelines for how I worked with the medicine, that's what I eventually put into my book, Entheogenic Liberation, which kind of discusses all of this and my model of how to go about working with 5-MeO, what I found to be most effective from doing this kind of work.
Nice. So why do you have the full experience? And I've met some of them. Why do they keep coming back for, I don't even know if I'm representing this question right, but I think you know what I'm saying. You know, why do they keep coming back? As if, I mean, I had the experience once, and I don't, I mean, of all of them, it's the only one I probably won't ever do or need again. Any thoughts on that? I'm especially in like the community where you know, they just keep coming back. It seems
Yeah.
like, I mean, obviously if you're a practitioner, there's a purpose for that, but
Yeah. Well, for a lot of people, there's a lot of different layers that they can move through, and that some people, they have to do a lot of unwinding and releasing before they can get to the full experience. And other people, it actually goes the other way, that they have the full experience, and then later they encounter their resistances and
right.
Places where they still need to process through. And that if you continue working with the medicine, and if you work with it in a really conscious and intentional way, it can allow for a deep level of reformatting
Right.
of your sense of self.
Right.
And that usually doesn't happen from just one experience. That can be profound, it could be life-changing. But in terms of the working through the reformatting and restructuring, that often takes a bit of work. Also, there is, for many people, that you kind of get this afterglow from the experience that can last for a period of time, but then people feel like they fall back into their old patterns. That, you know, the ego is very resilient, it's very tenacious. And it can be hard to let go of self-limiting patterns and beliefs and structures. And so getting the whole thing blown out again can be useful for
Right.
people.
Right.
And there can also be a sense of forgetting, like, wow, I felt connected, but now I feel disconnected. So I want to go back, and people want to remember that experience. And then it's also true that some people just get very attached to the experience and like, oh, I want to experience that all the time. And that's usually where then another red flag comes up and says, hey, what are you doing? You know, are you just using this as an escape, or are you really intentionally working with it? And, you know, like people ask me, a lot of people who maybe haven't read like my memoir or something, and just hear about me or something like that, that people thought, people would come to me and say, wow, well, you must have done this like every day, you know, and it's like, well, no, actually, when I was going through my own personal transformation process and awakening, over the course of about a year and a half, something like that, I did it maybe 10 or 12 times.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's what it took for me. And now I've done it a lot more since then, but that's because I was using it with the clients that I was working with. So that was for the clients. That was never for me. It's not that I was looking for anything. It was just, I'm going to go all the way into the energy with them to help them process that energy more effectively. And so
Right.
it's a tool for that, but it's not me looking for anything. And so that I do think that there is value in going back to it. And what I found was that my experiences, that I encountered different aspects of myself in going back in. And like the first time I did it, there was no resistance. The second time I did it, there was resistance. And then I let go. And then there was a level of processing that didn't happen before. And then things that each experience built on the one that came before it. And so that it was kind of like going through this educational program. And that's where all the energetic reformatting was taking place.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So there definitely can be value to it. But I think we should always be cautious if someone is just like running to it, to looking like, oh, if I just take another round of 5-MeO, it's going to solve all my problems, you know, or if I take it enough times, I'll be enlightened and liberated. And like, it doesn't work that way.
Well, I've seen that. That's why I'm commenting on it. And it's unique because it doesn't have the tolerance buildup that the other traditional psychedelics have. So it is, I don't know that you could quote unquote abuse it, but you could use it with a regularity whereas with the others, you really cannot. So.
Yeah. And that is something that I have seen, where I've seen people who've gotten a hold of their own supply of 5-MeO.
Right.
And then they're doing it like 10 times a day.
Right.
And it's usually with the self-created narrative of, well, I'm going to take it until I become enlightened. It's like, well, that's not very enlightened. But
well, it's like I said, running. It's like running to lose weight is the idea.
yeah, it's like, well, if I just get enough exercise with this, then finally it'll stick. And you know, it doesn't work that way. It's just an opportunity.
Right.
It's not going to automatically do anything to you. It's not like, well, I've done it 20 times, so all my problems must be solved, and I must be an enlightened master now. No,
Right.
it doesn't work that way.
Right.
You know, in the most practical sense, it can help you learn how to be more authentic, to go back to the point that I've made a couple times now, and how to be true to your energy, that are you actually expressing and embodying what you truly think and truly feel? Or are you making up a story? Are you attached to beliefs? Are you constricting or trying to create yourself in some certain kind of way? Or are you just being present and authentic? And 5-MeO, going back into that, multiple times can help people with that. But even there, it's not like it's automatic,
Right.
because it's all about how you're choosing to work with it, what you're looking for.
Right. So what are your thoughts on, people are having stress and anxiety and probably depression as well right now with what's going on, and you've studied history, and this is part of our history, and we can put the there'll be investigations and all that as to what was and what wasn't done right, but specific to the person, what advice would you give for someone that is feeling anxiety due to the uniqueness of this, this experience, and what kind of wisdom would you give to someone that is having a hard time right now?
Yeah. I guess I would really just start with just try and be present with what's in front of you at any given moment. Because if you think a lot about what's going on, you can spend a lot of time projecting. You can spend a lot of time worrying. Like right now, we don't know everything about coronavirus, and I've seen plenty of people on Facebook just diving into these conspiracy theories and all of this stuff. And that's a place where I just wanted to tell people, like, whoa, first of all, just so you know, you're totally indulging your ego, and you're attaching yourself to stories and meanings. And we see this actually on both the left and the right, that people on the left, they get into the conspiracies, and the people on the right, it's all just a hoax, and it's all just the Democrats trying to undermine President Trump. And so people are kind of denying reality, or they're indulging beyond what's really immediately present. So, I would encourage people to, take stock of what's actually of value to you. Like, okay, so we're all kind of shut in, but hopefully you're in a comfortable home. Hopefully you have food, you have shelter, and know that we're kind of all going through this together. And there's a lot of uncertainty. I mean, this is Friday. We've been on extended spring break, but next week, my 7-year-old son, he's going to be doing homeschool and using Zoom to have his first grade class. I'm going to be teaching my university course over Zoom. I've never done an online course before. And so really everybody just taking a breath and understanding that, look, we're all in this together. We're all trying to figure it out as we go along. Nobody has all the answers. Nobody has all the solutions. And of course, I mean, I don't want to get coronavirus. I mean, as we talked about before, I've got this sleep issue. I've got a chronic sleep disorder. And just the thought of, like, my God, if I got this thing as well, I mean, that would just really, I already have a tough enough time as it is. But that would just be indulging in fear. And so do I have it now? Yeah. Not to my knowledge. Yeah. Am I relatively healthy? Yes, I am. Do I have access to the world, to the computer? Yes, I do. Do I have my family with me? Yes, I do. Can I still make dinner every night? Yes, I can. Can I still watch my favorite programs on TV and Netflix? Yes, I can. And, some of the beauty of what's happening right now is, I've actually been communicating more with family, more with friends than I had before. And there's, like, here in my neighborhood, there's a sense of solidarity, and among the parents and the teachers of my son's elementary school. And, one of the lessons of 5-MeO is that sometimes, in order for something more authentic and vibrant to arise, sometimes the old structures do need to break apart. And it can be scary, and it can be chaotic, So in a sense, this is kind of like, this is the big 5-MeO experience for everyone, in some ways, that there's a lot of uncertainty. The things that we've relied upon, the patterns that we're used to and comfortable with, those are all being broken apart. And that's kind of what happens in the 5-MeO experience, because your ego starts to break apart and you're like, oh my God, I don't know who I am. I don't know where I am. That sense of security is gone. But there's also a beautiful freedom that arises from accepting that there actually isn't any security, because, guess what? We're all going to die. Maybe it'll be COVID-19, maybe it'll be a car accident, maybe it'll be a heart attack. We're all going to die. So I think it's actually healthy for everyone to kind of accept that. I think Western cultures, especially with the projection of heaven and hell and stuff like that, that we've really projected a lot about death and what death means. And the cultural hero is Jesus. Jesus overcame death. And, that's a great story. My personal belief is that's just a story. And I think that accepting the reality is very important, and that it helps you be more at peace with what is taking place. And to kind of use myself as another example, that I do have this sleep disorder that affects me every night and every day. And I have virtually no control over it. The more I can personally just accept that and work within the structures that it necessitates within my life, the happier and more comfortable I am. The more I fight against that, the more I resist it, the more unhappy I am. So the clear choice is accept what you can, learn to work with it, and then again, be present. That sometimes when I think about my current sleep situation, I can think about my God, is this the way my life is going to be from here on out? And I mean, is this just going to be every night and every day? And that's something that can really get me down, because it's not a pleasant situation. And then I have to go back to, well, I don't actually know. I don't know. So the more energy I put into worrying about the things I don't know and trying to control the things that I can't control, the more unhappy I'm going to be.
Yeah.
And so we're all kind of faced with this right now, that we don't have a lot of control. We certainly do not have good leadership on this. So we don't have people that we can look to. So it's creating a lot of self-reliance. And that, especially if we can take sort of the compassionate approach that, look, we're all sheltering in place, not out of fear, but because that's the socially responsible thing to do.
Yeah.
That I think that can help us. And that when it comes to the larger picture of humanity and the environment, I mean, we are going to need to make some big changes if we want to have a sustainable future. And so this is just maybe a foreshadowing to, I mean, just imagine with climate change, and if we're getting millions of people displaced, and the societal chaos that that's going to create, and that we can't just go on consuming and polluting. And, here in the United States, why do we not have universal health care? I mean, it's just absurd. Why do we not have paid sick leave? That these are some things that we've been able to be kind of cavalier about. And so hopefully it can create some self-reflection and some positive societal change. And so I think that we can think about those things as well, but always go back to, am I in danger in this moment, or can I find peace and comfort with where I actually am to the best of my ability, given the reality of the situation? So not to deny the situation, but not to run away with it either, to just try and come back to reality.
Yeah. It's interesting, because it seems like a few takeaways. This virus, because it's so contagious, it has not needed, evolutionarily speaking, to mutate into something more deadly. So people are saying, well, it's not that deadly, which is absolutely true. It's the least deadly of all these viral outbreaks, since the Spanish flu. But because it's been able to become so contagious, it is not deadly. So it's you have to, if you have this micro understanding of the world, invariably, the next one of these has the potential to become extremely deadly, where it could become, because the Spanish flu is very similar. It was very mild at first, and then it mutated rapidly when it came back the next season, and it was very, it was very deadly.
Yeah.
So, we could have an avian bird flu where, we lose 2-3 billion people.
Yeah. And in a sense, it's almost thankful that we have this disease, because like here in the United States, it's really showing how inadequate the system is. That the response and our level of preparedness for something like this, just imagine if everybody who caught this died. I mean, my goodness, thank goodness it's only a percentage of people who catch this who die. But diseases are something that we need to live with. I mean, that's the reality of living in the world, that viruses and diseases are out there.
Yeah.
And that, it's really easy to focus on something like, oh, well, it's all the Muslims or it's the Mexicans, and let's build a border wall and let's go bomb some people. But in terms of the impact of how our society can be undermined, this is something very significant. And I think that, we haven't really paid attention to viruses, and we're now seeing the results of that. I also think we have not really taken seriously the environment and climate change. And
you see the rivers in Italy are now not loaded with plastic.
Yeah. And so this is disrupting business as usual.
Right.
And whatever it is that we go back to when this is done, if it's done, right, is not going to be the same. And so hopefully we can actually learn some things from this. And also in a way, it's kind of good that it's a global event.
Yeah.
That we can start to all think of, rather than country against country, religion against religion, people against people, that actually, we really are all in this together. And if we could work together, that's what's going to serve us the most. And I think if we approach disease and famine and poverty and the environment and with the same level of collectiveness, that I think that we have the potential to make the world a better place.
Yeah. I can't think of a better note to end on than that one right there.
All right.
Well, Martin, enjoy your quarantine week 3 weekend, and as will I, and everyone watching. Thanks for watching us, and leave your comments below. And also, Martin's website is martinball.net.
Yeah.
martinball.net. www.martinball.net. I'll leave a link also in the YouTube comments on that. All right, guys, optimize better and be good.